So, as I mentioned, Iran human rights started in 2005 by human rights defenders inside and outside Iran, and abolition of the death penalty has always been one of our main goals, in addition to working to promote the rule of law and defending human rights defenders. We are also members of the steering committee of the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty. And as it was mentioned, since 2011, we have been collaborating with the ACPM in publishing the annual reports. You can see the previous annual reports on our website or social media. So just to give you a short overview of this report, executions in 2021, we show that at least 333 people were executed in 2021. It's a 25% increase compared to 267 in the year before. And while rest of the world is going in the right direction, every year we hear about new countries either abolishing the death penalty by law or in practice, or joining the moratorium. Unfortunately, Islamic Republic of Iran is going in the wrong direction. The report also shows that more than 50% of the executions are based on murder charges, and about 38% for drug-related charges, which are not considered as the most serious crimes. As Ms. Nikate also mentioned, Islamic Republic of Iran, as one of the few countries in the world, continues execution of juvenile offenders. 2 juvenile offenders were executed in 2021, and 17 women. But I would like to excuse me for using numbers. When I say 333, we are talking about human beings, just like me and you, with families, and but we have to show these numbers. But just keep in mind that we are talking about human beings. And before going into the detail, I would also like to have your attention on the fact that in Iran, we do not have a due process. We do not have an independent judiciary. There is systematic use of torture to force confessions. And most of the time, almost in all death penalty cases, death sentences are issued based on the confessions extracted by the prisoner. There is lack of access to lawyer, at least in the investigation phase of after a person has been arrested, and the trials are unfair. So basically, the judiciary of the Islamic Republic can sentence anyone based on any charges to death if they wish so. So when I say that 55% were sentenced to death based on murder charges, these are charges that are in the court documents, but we have several examples where people have been sentenced to death for murder because they had to confess under torture. They had to confess to a murder they had not committed. So we should keep that in mind. The other thing is that the numbers that we are presenting, they are based on information from official sources, which includes official media and websites of the judiciary, and unofficial sources, which are family members, lawyers, sources in prisons, like other prisoners, other human rights groups. And these executions are not announced by the official media. We only include cases of unofficial or reports from unofficial sources if they are confirmed by two independent sources. So given the lack of transparency that we have in Iran, and also the risks that human rights defenders and those reporting on the death penalties are facing, we believe that the actual numbers are much higher. For instance, we have received reports of more than 40 executions that we have not included in this report because we couldn't confirm them by two independent sources. But if we look at the numbers that we have, out of these 333 that I mentioned who are included in this report, more than 83% are not announced by official sources. These are shown in yellow here, in orange here, and you see that only a minority, less than 20% of executions are announced. Another thing you see on this diagram, here you see the monthly executions, that there is a larger number of executions in the second half of the year. As you know, we had a presidential election around 19th of June 2021. And if we look at the number of executions before and after the presidential election, we see that there is a doubling of executions after presidential elections and election of Ebrahim Raisi. Although the president is not involved in the judiciary, but it shows in what situation the Islamic Republic of Iran is. Death penalty is not used to fight crime because everybody knows that it is not deterrent, but it is used to spread fear among people. Another thing that has happened after the presidential election is the new round of the negotiations between Western countries and the Islamic Republic of Iran to renew the nuclear agreement. So while Iran has been in direct communication and negotiations with the West, number of executions have increased dramatically. If we look at the timing of these executions, you see in June, between 1st and 18th of June, we had one execution. Between 19th and 30th of June, we had almost one execution every day. And what happened in June, as I mentioned, on 19th of June, we had the presidential election. So although most of those who are executed are sentenced to death for not political offenses like murder and drug trafficking, but the timing of the execution has a meaningful correlation with the political events. For instance, in the weeks prior to the presidential election, at least the 2 weeks before the elections, there are no executions, and it happens every 4th year. And the reason for that, we believe, is one, the world is looking at Iran. There are foreign journalists traveling to Iran. And at the same time, Iranian authorities want to encourage people to participate in the elections. So the execution numbers go down. But right after the elections, you see that at the month of July, we had close to 2 executions every single day. So this is the timing of executions in Iran are very coordinated, and they are based on political events. When the authorities fear protests, the numbers go up again. If we look at the charges, as I mentioned, more than 50%.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. Just I found out that our journalists do not have access to chat box. So if we will have a Q&A session after Mr. Amir Muqaddam's presentation. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand. I will give access to microphone after the presentation to you. And the full reports links in English and Persian and French will be pasted in the chat box. I'm very sorry, Mr. Amir Muqaddam, please continue.
No, thank you. Yes, so about the charges, as I mentioned, 55% are based on murder charges, 38% drug-related, and then we have 3% for charges such as rape, and 4% on vague charges, which we find in the Islamic Penal Code called muharebe, meaning waging war against God and corruption on earth and rebellion. I will come back to that. But if you look at the drug-related executions, at least 126 people were executed for such charges in 2021. This is Iran is the world's main executioner of for drug offenses. None of these executions were announced by the official media and official sources, and there is a overrepresentation of ethnic minorities, particularly the Baluch in southeastern Iran, among those who were executed for such charges. There were also 5 women among those who were executed. So behind these numbers, as I say, there are faces. I will show one of these faces, Ali Nehtani, a 30-year-old assistant bus driver on the Zahedan Mashhad route. He was arrested in 2019 and sentenced to death by the revolutionary courts. Here I can also say a little bit about the revolutionary courts. We had there are 2 kinds of courts that issue death sentences in Iran: the criminal courts and revolutionary courts. So drug-related offenses and security-related offenses, they are tried by the revolutionary courts. So these courts, in these courts, the judges have much more authority, and the lawlessness that we find and the arbitrariness that we find in the judicial system in Iran is even higher in the revolutionary courts. These courts are behind closed doors, and their aim is suppression. So it was mentioned that 126 people were executed for drug charges. This represents a 5-fold increase in number of drug-related executions compared to the previous 3 years. So from an average of between 20 and 30 executions in 2018 to 2020, we had 126 executions in 2021. And those of you who are not familiar with the background of this anti-narcotics law and the amendment to it, which is mentioned on this slide, in 2017, Iranian authorities they passed a law with the aim of reducing number of drug-related executions. The reason for this amendment, the main reason, was that United Nations Office for Drugs and Crimes, which has ongoing projects inside Iran to combat drug smuggling, and several European countries who actually cover the budget for these projects, and these include they have included several Western European countries. They put pressure on Iranian authorities to do something with this high number of drug-related executions. Between 2010 and 2017, we had in average 330 executions for drug offenses every year. Almost one person every year was executed for these charges. So based on international pressure and also pressure from civil society groups and human rights organizations, the authorities passed this law, and that led to a significant decrease in number of drug-related executions. So from an average of one daily, it went down to about 25 executions in a year. Unfortunately, this trend is reversed without any changes in the law. As I mentioned, since we don't have due process, basically anyone can be sentenced for any charges to death. So unfortunately, this dramatic increase in number of drug-related executions has not been met with um, any official reactions from the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crimes, and modest reactions from European governments involved in anti-drug projects in Iran. So we hope that these reactions will come. However, the European Parliament has passed a very strong resolution. I hope that the European governments will follow it up. About the security-related charges, as I mentioned, Moharebe, waging war against God, corruption on earth, and back. These are vague charges very often used to sentence members of banned opposition groups to death. 8 people charged with such executed based on these charges were linked to dissident groups which are mainly in ethnic regions of Iran. So 9 of these 13 belong to the ethnic minorities. One of them was Haydar Ghorbani, a Kurdish prisoner. He was sentenced to death for membership in a Kurdish political party, Kurdistan Democratic Party of Iran, and he was executed in December while judicial review was still pending in Supreme Court. His body was not returned to family, and in the death certificates, the cause of death is cited as unknown, although official Iranian media announced this execution. I also mentioned that 3% of people executed in Iran were based, their execution was based on rape and sexual assaults. One of them was Behzad Adl, whose picture you see here. The information that we have received shows that he was subjected to torture, including electric shocks, to give forced confessions. In the court, however, he denied all the charges. He was sentenced to death on charge of adultery by force. He was sentenced to 3 death sentences. And actually, he was executed 3 times. He was pulled up on the news 3 times, and his body left hanging for 2 hours in the prison. The whole process from arrest to execution took about 11 months. And the largest group of those who were executed is based on murder charges. You know, in Iran, based on Sharia, attempted murder is sentenced to retribution death penalty. So basically, the law says that the plaintiff, the family of the murder victim, they can decide whether they ask for retribution, which means death penalty, or blood money, or simply forgive. In 2021, 183 people were executed based on Qisas law. And among them, we find 2 juvenile offenders who were under 18 years of age at the time of the alleged offense. and 12 women. One of the ways of proving guilt in qisas cases, in murder cases, is kasame. It's an oath. Basically, 50 male members of the murder victim's family, they give an oath on the Holy Quran that they believe that person is guilty. So in 2021, 2 people were sentenced to death for murder charges based on kasame, where there was a ceremony. Mashallah Sabzi, the one on the top. There were 50 men who, some of them were not even the victim's family, and they were not, and they had not witnessed anything. They gave an oath that Mashallah was guilty, and he was sentenced to death and executed. He had also, there were also reports of torture and forced confessions. Ali Mardan Boland Gerami, he was sentenced also based on kasame for the murder of his wife. His wife died in her sleep while he was sleeping, and 50 male members of the wife's family who were not witness, they swore to his guilt, and he was executed. I mentioned that there were 2 juveniles among them. As you know, as I mentioned, Iran is one of the very, very few countries sentencing juvenile offenders to death. So these 2, one of them is Sajjad Sanjari. He was 15 years old at the time of the alleged crime. Allegedly, he stabbed an older boy in self-defense against rape. That's what they say. So there is a law in Iran that was introduced in 2013, Article 91, where, which says that if somebody under 18 years of age commits a serious crime, it's the judge can ask for a review of whether the person is mature enough to be sentenced to death. So he was considered to have reached full mental maturity according to documentation based on the body hair development. He was executed secretly in Kermanshah. Family was not informed about the execution, and the reason why it was executed secretly is because they know that the international community is more sensitive to juvenile executions. Arman Abdul Ali, he was sentenced to death for murdering his girlfriend. The body were never found, and he said repeatedly in the court that he has not committed a murder. He was taken to gallows 7 times before the execution. Sometimes the execution stopped because of international reactions, and sometimes we don't know why they took him to the gallows and brought him back. This by itself was a severe torture. And about the women, these 17 women, 12 of them were sentenced to death for murder charges and 5 on drug-related charges. Of the 12 murder charges, 8 were convicted of killing their husbands. There were reports of domestic violence in several of these cases. Just to demonstrate the inhumane face of this Qisas law, as I said, the authorities put the responsibility of the execution on the shoulders of the family of the murder victims. So people who already are victims of violence, they are giving the responsibility of committing a murder in the shape of an execution. Since 2010, 172 women have been executed in Iran. Iran is the world's largest executioner of women. One of these women, Zahra Esmaili, was charged with the murder of her husband, who was a government official. There are reports of domestic violence, both against her and her children. The day she was taken to execution, at least 9 people were executed in front of her, and she suffered a heart attack. And then her lifeless body was hanged, and the execution was conducted by her own son and mother-in-law. In the death certificate, the cause of death is mentioned as heart attack. Another woman, Maryam Karimi, charged with murder of husband, together, that both she and her father were sentenced for the murder of her husband. Her execution was carried out by her own daughter on 13th of March. So, although I have said about more than 180 people executed for murder charges, and the authorities put the responsibility of choosing whether to execute or not on family of the murder victim, we see a trend in Iran in the recent years. Last year, the families of murder victims who didn't choose retribution death sentence, but they choose rather forgiveness or accepting blood money, these numbers were far higher than those who choose death sentence. So 705 cases of forgiveness we have registered. The actual number is probably higher. This is a trend that has been growing in the recent years in Iran. As you can see, 2021 had the highest number of the last at least 7 years. And it also fits with a survey we together with the World Coalition Against the Death Penalty did. It was Gaman Association who did the survey for us, asking 20,000 Iranians inside Iran, what would you choose if a close member of your family was murdered? And about 70% answered that they would choose another punishment than qisas or retribution. So that's a new way of saying no to the death penalty in Iran. So finally, I will say a few words about the ethnic minorities. They are overrepresented in the execution numbers. However, in the ethnic regions of Iran, more than 90% of all executions are not announced. So actually, most probably the actual number of executions are much higher. And we mentioned about Baluch minorities. 70 Baluch prisoners were executed in 2021. They account for 21% of the total executions. According to the different sources, the Baluch population, they account for something between 1.5% to 5% of the population. So they are grossly overrepresented. Most of those executed were for drug-related charges, and many of the executions, they took place outside Baluchistan in other prisons. Now I have given you so many numbers about execution. There is, beside the forgiveness trend, there is one good positive development in 2021. For the first time since Iran Human Rights started monitoring the death penalty, we didn't have any public executions in Iran. So 2021, no public executions were reported. Although we know that the reason for reduction in the number of public executions in 2020 was COVID pandemic and the COVID restrictions. However, the fact that no public executions was implemented, we regard it as a very positive development. Unfortunately, it's not based on a political decision, and we know that authorities are preparing new public executions. However, we think that now we have an opportunity to stop public executions forever in Iran. As you know, Iran is one of the very few countries doing this, conducting executions in public spaces. So I think if the international community shows strong reactions, there are 3 planned public executions. At least the judges have ordered public executions. If we get strong enough reactions, this might not happen, because for the Iranian authorities, political cost is very important. So raising the political cost is important. At the very end, I will just show you some pictures of people who are at risk of execution. They are these 2 juveniles, Mustafa Emdadi and Hossein Shahbazi. We still can save them. There are some protesters at risk, people who were either sentenced to death for participation in nationwide protests, or they are being tried. And I hope that international community get engaged. And very, very at the end, dual nationals at risk. Ahmad Reza Jalali, Swedish Iranian physician and scientist, he's on the death row. We hope that international pressure will not let Iranian authorities to do the execution. There are 2 other dual citizens, Jamshid Sharmat, a German-Iranian dissident. He was kidnapped in United Arab Emirates and currently on trial for charges that can give him death sentence. The same with Habib Shab, a Swedish Iranian dissident kidnapped from Turkey. He can also be sentenced to death. I'm so sorry going over time. So I hope that we can have some discussion about how international community can help. And as Ms. Aminata Nikate mentioned, we believe that international community can play a very important role, and we hope that they use this opportunity. Thank you so much, and I will end my presentation here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mahmoud Amir Muqaddam, Director of Iran Human Rights.